Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen spent all last week taking on a million self-funded retirees by raising these taxes or reducing the refunds on their savings. Henry Ergas wrote in The Australian last week, when imputation credits were made fully reimbursable on Peter Costello's watch, Labor was positively gushing. The then Deputy Leader of the Labor Party in the Senate, Peter Cook, said that the kind of reimbursements, that's the refunds, that are now going to be taken away would prove benefits to a low-income person who earns a little investment income. Peter Cook talked about the very reforms that Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen are wanting to take away as improving the current taxation system. Therefore, Labor had, quote, no difficulty supporting the proposal. Now Labor seems to be saying they'll scrap the full refundability of imputation franking credits, and that's suddenly become good policy. Now, Peter and I will look at that in more detail next week when it becomes clearer where this issue's going. But with all that swimming around them, Labor nonetheless won the by-election in the seat of Batman, which may further encourage the Labor Party. And while the Liberals have won in South Australia, it seems impossible to believe that Labor, with what I believe the most irresponsible government we've ever seen in this country, Labor in South Australia lost only 4 seats. And the swing against the Liberal Party was over 7%. Nick Xenophon is gone. Whether we'll see him again is another thing. And the new Premier of South Australia, Steve Marshall, is talking about a new dawn. But in everything Marshall said on Sunday, the day after his victory, nothing was said about the most critical of all issues, energy supply. South Australia has demonised coal-fired power. What's Mr Marshall going to do? Is he going to follow down this renewable energy route? Wetherell, the reckless outgoing Premier, was spending more than $500 million on emergency diesel generators. He was talking about the world's largest battery and state-owned gas generation, an absolute shambles, which was putting consumers and business into penury, as is energy policy all over the country. I've said many times this is the biggest issue confronting this nation since Federation, excluding war. Well, what is the new Premier, Steve Marshall, going to do about rebuilding the state's electricity sector? What's he going to do about lowering costs, fostering investment? Daniel Wild is a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He specialises in red tape, regulation, economic policy, the philosophy of free enterprise, amongst other things. He previously worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where he analysed global and domestic macroeconomic policy. Prior to that, he worked at the Commonwealth Department of Finance, where he worked on regulatory reform. Well, on the eve of the election last week, he called it a referendum on electricity and renewable energy. Well, Wetherell's gone, thank God. But as Daniel Wild wrote, South Australia is one of the most reckless energy policies in Australia, with heavy confiscation of taxpayer funds and forced cross-subsidisation, feeding the present 50% renewable energy target. Yet the Turnbull government is signed up to the Paris Agreement. That's a commitment to a 42% renewable energy target. And as David Wild wrote, recent analysis by the Australian Energy Council shows that electricity prices in South Australia during the recent summer were about 260% higher than they were in 2014-2015. And as he said, that's 41 times the growth in average wages. On Sunday, the new Premier in waiting, Marshall, had nothing to say about energy. Daniel Wild joins us from Melbourne. Daniel, thank you for your time and thank you for your observations, which you're going to share with our viewers. How bad is all of this?
Well, it's extremely bad, Alan. Australians have been let down by at least a decade of very bad energy policy. There was a brief reprieve during the Abbott government through the abolition of the carbon tax, which put downward pressure on prices. But other than that, it's been extremely bad at the state and Commonwealth level. And the key driver of this is subsidisation of renewable energy, simply because renewables are more intermittent, they're less dependent, and they're more expensive than coal. And we know they're more expensive than coal because we have to subsidise renewables to get them onto market. There's been $60 billion in subsidies going to renewable energy over to the period 2030. This is pushing coal out of the market and it's reducing the dependability and reliability of our energy supply. And as you noted in your introduction, this has been increasing prices. There's been about a 12.5% increase in prices on average over the last decade across the country, concentrated in South Australia with a 260% increase in prices over the past 4 summers. And this is driving business investment away, it's driving people out of South Australia to the eastern seaboard, and it's making Australia a far less attractive destination for businesses to come in and invest.
But that being said, which I agree with you entirely, I've been saying it, Peter and I have been saying this for God knows how long, but nonetheless, the Turnbull government, it's easy to vilify Labor for 50% renewable energy target. They've got 23.5%. They've signed up to Paris, the Paris Agreement, on 42%. There doesn't seem to be any willingness to seek a policy differentiation by saying, listen, we're going to abolish all these subsidies, there'll be no subsidies for renewable energy, and we're going to not demonise coal-fired power. We don't seem to have a realisation in Canberra that direction has to change.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. And the key policy issue here is the whole framing of the energy policy debate by the Turnbull government, which is around, they come up with this idea of the so-called trilemma, which is affordability, reliability and emissions reductions. But you don't need to have emissions reductions in this country, because what we do does not make any noticeable difference to the global climate. Australia accounts for just 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that the renewable energy target at the Commonwealth level has reduced our emissions by just 0.0004% per year on average on a global basis, which means it's doing next to nothing with regards to reducing emissions. And that is to say, if you think reducing emissions is even a worthwhile objective in and of itself, which is highly debatable. But what it is causing is severe and irreparable economic damage. We know that business investment today is just 12% of GDP. Now, that is lower than what it was during the economically disastrous Whitlam years. And so this is having flow-on consequences. You see low wages growth, which is because we have less investment. We have low labour productivity growth, which is because we have less business investment. It's permeating right through the economy, and we're not getting anything out of it in terms of benefits.
Oh, God, aren't we lucky to have you? Can you just cite, I noticed you cited an example of this family-run recycling business. I mean, you've got to say this 100 times to even get your head around it. They had an increase in monthly electricity bill from $80,000 to $180,000.
That's right. There was a business in Kilburn, which is in the suburban areas of Adelaide, and it had a $100,000 increase to its monthly bills, and that sent it out of business. It closed down after 38 years of operation, employing 35 people. And these are the kinds of businesses that are affected. It's the small businesses that are employing 5 people here, 10 people here, 20 people there, and they simply cannot absorb these prices. I mean, a 260% increase in 4 years is not going to be absorbed by a business with wafer-thin profit margins, and that's the reality of a small business. They're on wafer-thin margins, and that aside, all this money could be going to higher wages. I mean, imagine if you're saving that $100,000 on lower bills, you could be employing more staff, investing more capital, putting out cheaper products, or raising wages.
Daniel, I just want to go to a release this week from, late last week, Clean Energy Regulator. We will pay, under their estimates, an extra $1 billion in subsidies for renewables next year. This is an above and beyond government expenditure in this area. So I think when people hear about renewable subsidies, they think somehow it's coming from the magic pudding that is taxpayer funds. But just explain to people, this is actually coming from the household without the solar panels, subsidising by having higher energy prices, the household with the solar panels. And it's usually the case that the wealthier person can afford to $10,000 or $15,000 to put the panels on their roof, and the more modest incomes, the larger families, low-income families, they are the ones that not only don't have the panels on their roof, but are paying the higher energy prices to cross-subsidise.
Well, I mean, that's spot on. So you can access subsidies for solar panels and solar energy generation, but of course only people of certain means can afford to do that. So they get the benefit of these subsidies that are provided. They're cross-subsidised by people who don't have those solar panels, which are typically people of lower economic means. And what they're doing is they're actually putting in a less reliable, a less dependable form of energy generation. So what they're doing is they're getting the benefits of the subsidies, of the cross-subsidisation that's going on in the market, but this is disproportionately harming the lower-income households who can't access those subsidies. So
just before you go on, to interrupt you there's a strip that's just gone onto the TV screen here, which you wouldn't have seen, Daniel, which says newly elected South Australian Premier Steve Marshall says his government will follow the recommendations of Dr Finkel's report. Finkel is talking about 42% renewable energy targets. I mean, when is someone going to get the message?
Well, I mean, that's disappointing. What Marshall said during the campaign was that he would eliminate the state-based renewable energy target, which is a very positive development, and he should be congratulated for that. Now, if he goes ahead with it, we'll have to wait and see, but he should be doing that, and defaulting to a national market, which is the National Energy Guarantee. Now, this needs to be resolved through COAG and through the Commonwealth level, but it really needs to be the Turnbull government taking a leadership role here and saying enough is enough. We're not doing anything for the environment, but we're pushing up prices, and it has to end.
Just before we go, look, isn't a simple proposition. We are the largest energy exporter in the world. We now have almost the highest electricity prices. We're happy to export coal, for example, to China and India so they can have cheap electricity. And here we are demonising coal-fired power, subsidising renewables and putting people's electricity prices through the roof. I don't understand. Am I missing something?
Well, unfortunately not. I mean, we have 1,000 years' worth of coal in this country, and there's no reason why we can't be digging it up and using it ourselves. But, you know, unfortunately, the scare campaign about the environmental consequences of coal has taken hold. And the reality is that if you have fewer coal mines and less coal production in Australia, that doesn't mean you have less across the world. It just means, as you point out, that that's going to go to China, it's going to go to Vietnam, it's going to go to India. And so instead of having that coal production take place here, we're exporting to other countries where the coal is typically dirtier. And in doing so, we're also foregoing an important source of job creation and an important source of export revenue.
Good on you. Wonderful. You keep talking. That's Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. I said to Terry McCrann, I think, Daniel, many, many years ago, you go down this route, you're signing a national economic suicide note. It's arriving every week in our mailbox via the electricity bill. We'll keep talking. Lovely to have you on the program, Daniel. There he is, Daniel Wild, talking a lot of sense, Peter.